Sometimes a man's greatest regret isn't what he's done, but who he's failed to save. For Silas Boone, that regret had worn a path in his heart deeper than any cattle trail. When he saw four sisters chained together on that Mercy Ridge platform, something inside him broke open. $3 silver was all it took to buy their freedom, but folks saw it different. They whispered he'd bought himself some property, some help around his vast ranch. The oldest sister was 25, the youngest barely 16. Each one carried wounds that went deeper than their shackles. Silas wasn't looking for servants or companions. He was a wealthy man searching for redemption, hoping these broken souls might help him find what he'd lost when his own family died. But what happens when the past comes calling for what it thinks it owns? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust never settled in Mercy Ridge. It hung in the air like a promise half-kept, coating everything in a fine layer of prairie grit that reminded folks they were still fighting the land for every breath. Silas Boone had grown accustomed to the taste of it, the way it gathered in the creases around his eyes and settled into the weathered lines of his hands. At 58, he'd earned every one of those lines, carved them through decades of building something from nothing in a place that didn't much care for builders. His ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of rolling grassland, a testament to stubborn determination and the kind of luck that comes disguised as hard work. The main house sat like a fortress against the endless sky, built from local stone and timber he'd hauled himself in the early days when every board and nail represented a choice between comfort and survival. Now, 23 years later, the Lazy Bee Ranch stood as one of the largest cattle operations in the territory, employing 37 men and supporting nearly twice that many families in town. But success, Silas had learned, was a peculiar burden. It drew attention he'd never wanted and created distances he'd never intended. Folks in Mercy Ridge spoke his name with a mixture of respect and wariness, the way they might reference a force of nature. Powerful, necessary, but unpredictable. They remembered the young man who'd arrived with nothing but determination and a worn-out horse, but they couldn't quite reconcile that memory with the man who now owned more land than some small counties back east. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built an empire to create a legacy, only to find himself with no one to leave it to. Margaret had been gone 12 years now, claimed by the same fever that took their 2 boys within a week of each other. The memory still hit him like a physical blow, the way grief could ambush a man even after all these years. Their laughter had once filled every corner of the stone house, making it feel alive in ways that all his success couldn't replicate. Now the rooms echoed with a silence so profound it seemed to have weight. He'd tried to fill that silence with work, throwing himself into expanding the ranch, improving the herds, building something that would matter. But cattle didn't gather around the dinner table sharing stories of their day. Ledger books didn't ask about your dreams or worry when you came home late, and all the money in 3 territories couldn't buy back a single evening of Margaret reading to the boys by lamplight while he worked on the accounts nearby. The ranch hands respected him, some even liked him, but they went home to their own families at the end of each day. Silas went home to empty rooms and memories that had grown thin from too much handling, like photographs that fade when exposed to too much light. That morning in late September had started like any other. He'd risen before dawn, checked on the horses, reviewed the day's tasks with his foreman, Jake Morrison, a steady man who'd been with him for 8 years and understood that Silas's silences weren't unfriendliness, just the habit of a man who'd grown used to his own company. "Boss," Jake had said, adjusting his hat against the morning chill, "that chain gang's supposed to come through town today. Might want to keep the men close to the ranch. You know how folks get when there's trouble passing through." Silas had nodded, only half listening. Chain gangs were a regular sight in these parts, prisoners being transported to work camps or territorial prisons. The sight always left him unsettled, Not from fear, but from a deeper discomfort with seeing human beings reduced to cargo. Still, it was none of his business, and he had enough of his own concerns without borrowing others. But something had drawn him to town that afternoon. Perhaps it was the restlessness that had been growing in him lately, a feeling that his carefully ordered world was somehow incomplete. Or maybe it was the letter he'd received from his brother back in Illinois, asking when Silas might visit, mentioning grandchildren Silas had never met, and a life that seemed impossibly distant from his own reality. Mercy Ridge's main street buzzed with an energy that spoke of anticipation and unease. The chain gang had indeed arrived, their wagon train parked near the depot while officials conducted their business. Silas had seen such sights before, but this time something made him pause. 4 young women sat shackled together on a wooden platform, waiting with the resigned patience of those who'd learned that resistance only brought more pain. They ranged in age from what looked like 16 to perhaps 25, each one a study in carefully contained despair. Their clothes were worn but clean, their hair pulled back in simple styles that spoke of small attempts to maintain dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. The oldest sat with her back straight, green eyes fixed on some distant horizon as if she could will herself anywhere but here. There was a strength in her bearing that even shackles couldn't diminish, though Silas could see the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. Beside her, a woman with dark hair and serious eyes held the youngest close, creating a shelter with her own body that spoke of protection and love that transcended their circumstances. The gesture was so tender, so fierce, that it caught in Silas's chest like a fishhook. The third woman kept her head down, auburn hair falling like a curtain across features that might have been beautiful if not etched with something that looked like shame. She seemed to be trying to disappear into herself, as if making herself small enough might somehow make her invisible. And the youngest, barely more than a girl, leaned into her protector's embrace with the trust of someone who'd found safety in the midst of chaos. Her face held an innocence that seemed both heartbreaking and miraculous, given their circumstances. Silas found himself unable to look away. There was something about these 4 that reached past his carefully constructed defenses, past the walls he'd built around his heart after losing his family. Perhaps it was the way they clung to each other, creating a family unit even in chains. Perhaps it was the fierce love he could see in the way the dark-haired woman held the youngest, or the protective stance of the oldest despite her own fear. Or perhaps it was simply that, for the first time in 12 years, he saw people who needed saving and he remembered what it felt like to have a purpose beyond profit margins and herd counts. The chain gang foreman, a weathered man with cruel eyes and hands that spoke of violence, was conducting business with the territorial marshal. Their conversation was too distant to hear, but their gestures made clear that these 4 women were part of a transaction, human beings reduced to entries in a ledger book. "Selling them off?" said a voice beside him. Silas turned to find Doc Harley, the town's physician and one of the few people in Mercy Ridge who spoke to him as an equal rather than a boss or a dangerous benefactor. "Selling. Work contracts," Doc explained, his lined face creased with distaste. "Someone pays the territorial fees and takes responsibility for them for a set period. Usually means hard labor, sometimes worse. Those 4 been traveling for near 3 weeks, from what I heard. Sisters, they say. What's their crime?" Doc shrugged. "Does it matter? Could be theft, could be vagrancy, could be someone needed to make an example. Justice ain't always the same thing as fairness, as you well know." Silas did know. He'd seen enough of frontier justice to understand that law and morality didn't always align, especially when it came to those without power or protection. These 4 women had neither, and their fate would be determined by whoever was willing to pay for the privilege of owning their labor. The foreman's voice carried across the platform as he began his pitch to a small crowd that had gathered. "Fine workers, all of him, young and strong, trained in domestic duties. Contracts run 2 years, renewable at owner discretion. Bidding starts at $3 for the lot. $3 for 4 human lives. Silas had spent more than that on a single bottle of whiskey he'd never even opened. He watched the crowd, recognizing most of the faces. There was Ben Hartwell, who ran the saloon and had a reputation for being rough with his hired girls. Tom Morrison, Jake's cousin, who owned the hotel and had been known to work his staff from dawn to midnight without adequate food or rest. And standing near the back, almost hidden in shadow, was Claude Brennan, a man whose ranch had a turnover rate that raised questions no one seemed willing to ask. The sight of these men evaluating the 4 sisters like livestock made something cold and sharp turn over in Silas's stomach. He thought of Margaret, of how she'd looked at him with complete trust the day he'd promised to love and protect her. He thought of their boys, of the way they'd run to him when they were frightened or hurt, believing absolutely in his ability to make things right. He couldn't make things right for his own family. They were gone, beyond his reach and protection. But these 4 women, sitting shackled and afraid on a wooden platform while men bid for the right to own them, they were here now, and he had the power to change their fate. $3, the foreman called again. Do I hear $3? Ben Hartwell raised his hand, grinning in a way that made Silas's jaw clench. The foreman nodded, pointing in his direction. $3 to Mr. Hartwell. Do I hear $10? Silas said, his voice carrying clearly across the platform. The crowd turned to stare, and he could feel their surprise like a physical weight. $10 was more than most of these men made in a month, an absurd amount for what they saw as a simple labor contract. The foreman's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a man who just found unexpected profit. $10 to Mr. Boone. Do I hear sold? Silas said firmly. $10 for all 4, and I'll pay now. He reached into his vest and pulled out his money clip, counting out the bills while the crowd murmured around him. But as he approached the platform, he found himself pulling out 3 silver dollars instead, the same denomination as the opening bid, though more than 3 times the amount. Something about those particular coins felt right, felt significant in a way he couldn't quite name. They were old, worn smooth by countless hands, and they carried a weight that went beyond their monetary value. As he placed them in the foreman's outstretched palm, he felt the peculiar sensation that he was participating in something larger than a simple business transaction. The 4 sisters looked up at him with expressions ranging from wariness to hope to outright fear. The youngest whispered something to her protector, who whispered back without taking her eyes off Silas's face. He could see her trying to read his intentions, to determine whether he represented salvation or simply a different kind of danger. Papers, the foreman said, handing over a bundle of documents that made the transaction legal and binding. They're yours for 2 years, renewable if you want 'em longer. Names are all there. Clara, Beth, Emma, and Grace. Ages and such are listed, though I wouldn't put too much stock in the details. Records ain't always reliable on folks like this. Silas took the papers without looking at them, his attention focused on the 4 women who were now, legally speaking, his responsibility. The weight of that hit him suddenly. He'd just purchased 4 human beings regardless of his intentions. In the eyes of the law, they belonged to him as surely as his cattle or his horses. The crowd was already dispersing, their entertainment over, but he could feel their curiosity like heat radiating from a fire. By nightfall, everyone in Mercy Ridge would know that Silas Boone had paid $10 for 4 female convicts. The speculation would be endless, and most of it wouldn't be kind. He didn't care. For the first time in years, he'd acted on instinct rather than calculation, on feeling rather than logic. It felt like waking up from a long sleep, like stepping out of a house he'd been trapped in without realizing the door was unlocked. "Come on, then," he said quietly, addressing the 4 women for the first time. "Let's get you out of those chains." The blacksmith's shop smelled of coal smoke and heated iron, familiar scents that usually brought Silas comfort. Today they seemed heavy, oppressive, as he watched old Pete Henderson work the key that would free 4 lives from their bonds. The chains were old but well-maintained, their iron links worn smooth by too many wrists and ankles over the years. "Unusual request, Silas," Pete muttered, not looking up from his work. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, but there was something in his tone that suggested disapproval. "Folks are already talking?" "Let them talk," Silas replied, though he could feel the weight of curious stares from the street beyond. Word traveled fast in Mercy Ridge, and by now half the town would know what had transpired at the depot. The 4 sisters sat on wooden crates near the forge, still chained, but somehow different now that they belonged to him rather than the territorial system. The oldest, Clara, according to the papers, kept her green eyes fixed on his face, studying him with an intensity that made him wonder what she saw there. Beth, the dark-haired protector, maintained her vigil over young Grace, one arm never leaving the girl's shoulders. Emma, the one with auburn hair and downcast eyes, seemed to be trying to disappear into the shadows despite the bright glow from the forge. "There," Pete said finally, the last shackle falling away with a metallic clang that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. "They're free. Free." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that none of them were quite ready to examine. Legally, these women were bound to him for 2 years. Practically, they had nowhere else to go and no resources to get there. But physically, for the first time in months, they were unrestrained. Grace was the first to move, rubbing her wrists where the metal had chafed the skin raw. Beth immediately reached for the girl's hands, examining the angry red marks with the practiced eye of someone who'd been tending wounds long before today. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, her voice carrying a dignity that shackles hadn't been able to touch. "Whatever your reasons, thank you." Silas nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. He wasn't sure what his reasons were, beyond an impulse that had seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "We should get to the ranch before dark," he said. "It's a fair ride, and you'll want to see your new home in daylight." New home. The words felt strange in his mouth, presumptuous somehow. These women hadn't chosen to come with him, hadn't had any say in their destination. Yet something in Clara's expression suggested she understood the difference between what he was offering and what they might have received elsewhere. The ride to the Lazy Bee took nearly an hour, Silas on horseback beside a wagon he'd borrowed from the livery stable. The 4 sisters sat in the wagon bed, finally able to talk freely without guards listening to every word. Their conversation was quiet, conducted in the sort of half-whispers that spoke of shared secrets and mutual protection. Silas found himself listening despite trying to give them privacy. Their voices painted a picture of loyalty and love that transcended their circumstances. Clara seemed to be the leader, making decisions and offering reassurance. Beth was the protector, constantly checking on the others' comfort and well-being. Emma spoke rarely, but when she did, her words carried a sharp intelligence that suggested education beyond what her circumstances might imply. And Grace, sweet, young Grace, brought light to their small circle simply by being herself, by maintaining hope in a situation designed to crush it. The first sight of his ranch never failed to stir something in Silas's chest, but today it felt different. He tried to see it through their eyes, the sprawling stone house with its wraparound porch and tall windows, the well-maintained outbuildings, the vast pastures where cattle grazed in peaceful contentment. It was prosperity made visible, success carved from wilderness and stubbornness. But it was also empty. All that space, all those rooms, and for 12 years it had housed only one lonely man in his memories. "It's beautiful," Grace whispered, her young voice carrying wonder that made Silas's throat tighten unexpectedly. Jake Morrison met them at the main house, his weathered face carefully neutral. Silas had sent word ahead, but he could see the questions in his foreman's eyes, the confusion about what exactly his boss intended to do with 4 female convicts. "Jake, I'd like you to meet Clara, Beth, Emma, and Grace," Silas said, dismounting and helping the women down from the wagon. "They'll be staying at the ranch." "Ma'am," Jake said politely, touching his hat brim. He was a good man, fair and honest, but Silas could see him struggling to understand the situation. "Boss, where exactly did you want them?" "The house," Silas said firmly. "They'll be staying in the main house." The silence that followed was profound. Jake's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, and the 4 sisters exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their own surprise. Hired help lived in the bunkhouse or the smaller cabins scattered around the property. Convict laborers would typically be housed in the barn or rough shelter built for that purpose. "The house has 8 bedrooms," Silas continued, addressing the women directly. "Most of them haven't been used in years. You can choose whichever ones suit you. Get settled in. Mrs. Chen in the kitchen will see you fed." Clara stepped forward, her green eyes searching his face. "Mr. Boone, I don't understand. What exactly do you expect from us?" It was a fair question, and one he didn't have a good answer for. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure what he expected, what he hoped for, or what he was trying to accomplish. All he knew was that something had shifted inside him when he saw them on that platform, something that made his empty house feel less like a monument to loss and more like a possibility. "I expect you to heal," he said finally, the words surprising him with their honesty. "I expect you to rest, to eat proper meals, to remember what it feels like to be safe. Beyond that, we'll figure things out as we go." "But the contract," Emma spoke for the first time since leaving town, her voice barely above a whisper. "It says we're bound to work." "The contract says you're bound to me," Silas interrupted gently. "It doesn't specify what kind of work or how much or under what conditions. Far as I'm concerned, you've worked hard enough just surviving whatever brought you to that platform today." Beth's arm tightened around Grace's shoulders, and Silas saw tears gathering in the younger woman's eyes. These were people who'd been shown precious little kindness, he realized. His simple offer of basic human dignity was overwhelming them. "There's no catch," he added, anticipating their next question. "No hidden expectations, no debt beyond what's already written on those papers. This is just a man with a big empty house offering shelter to folks who need it." "Why?" Clara asked bluntly. "Why would you do this for strangers?" Silas looked past them toward the house, toward windows that had been dark for too long. "Maybe because I need it as much as you do," he said quietly. "Maybe because this place was built to hold a family, and it's been waiting 12 years for one to fill it again." The words hung in the evening air, honest and vulnerable in a way he hadn't intended. But they were true, he realized. This wasn't charity or even simple kindness. This was a desperate man's attempt to breathe life back into a home that had become a beautiful tomb. "Come on, then," he said, clearing his throat and starting toward the house. "Let's get you settled before supper. Mrs. Chen makes the best beef stew in 3 territories, and I suspect you could all use a proper meal." As they walked toward the main house, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in over a decade: anticipation. Not just for tomorrow or next week, but for the possibility that his carefully ordered world might be about to become beautifully, chaotically alive again. Behind him, he could hear the quiet murmur of the sisters' conversation, full of wonder and disbelief and the first tentative notes of hope. And for the first time since Margaret and the boys had died, Silas Boone felt like he was walking toward home rather than just another empty evening in a house full of ghosts. The first morning dawned gray and uncertain, much like the atmosphere that had settled over the Boone ranch. Silas had risen before sunrise, as was his habit, but found himself hesitating at the kitchen door. For 12 years, his morning routine had been solitary. Coffee with Mrs. Chen, a review of the day's tasks, then out to check on the horses before the rest of the ranch came alive. Today, that routine felt fragile, likely to shatter at the first sign of the changes he'd set in motion. Mrs. Chen, a practical woman in her 50s who'd worked for him since Margaret's death, stood at the stove with her back rigid with disapproval. She hadn't said a word about his decision to bring 4 female convicts into the main house, but her silence spoke volumes. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," he said quietly, reaching for the coffee pot. "Morning," she replied curtly, not turning from her work. Steam rose from several pots on the stove, more food than she'd prepared for breakfast in years. At least she was feeding them, he thought with relief. They settle in all right. Mrs. Chen turned to face him then, her dark eyes holding the sort of frank assessment he'd learned to respect. "Those girls are scared, Mr. Boone, scared and confused and trying to figure out what you want from them. The young one, Grace," she cried herself to sleep. The dark-haired one, Beth. She stayed awake all night listening for trouble. "They're not settled. They're surviving." Her words hit him harder than he'd expected. Of course they were frightened. They'd been prisoners, property, bought and sold like cattle. His good intentions didn't erase that reality or the trauma they carried. "What would you do, Mrs. Chen? In my position?" She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You did right, bringing them here. Better this than what that Hartwell fellow had in mind. But good intentions aren't enough now. They need to know what's expected, what the rules are, what happens if they step out of line. Uncertainty is its own kind of prison." Before Silas could respond, soft footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of his guests. Clara appeared first, dressed in the same worn dress from yesterday, but with her hair neatly braided and her shoulders squared with determination. Beth followed, one protective hand on Grace's shoulder, the other maintaining a careful distance from the kitchen knives that hung within easy reach. Emma came last, moving like a shadow, her eyes downcast and her whole demeanor suggesting she'd prefer to disappear entirely. "Good morning," Clara said politely, though Silas could see the tension in her posture. "We weren't sure about the arrangements for meals." "You'll eat with me," Silas said, then realized how that might sound. "I mean, at the same table, as family would." The word felt strange on his tongue, presumptuous, but he pressed on. "Mrs. Chen's prepared enough food for an army, looks like." Mrs. Chen snorted softly, but began loading plates with eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits. The portions were generous, more food than the sisters had probably seen in months, and Silas watched Grace's eyes widen with something approaching awe. They ate in careful silence, the clink of silverware against china unnaturally loud in the spacious dining room. Silas found himself studying each of them, trying to read their stories in their faces and gestures. Clara ate with deliberate precision, every movement controlled and purposeful. Beth took small bites while constantly monitoring Grace, ready to intervene if needed. Emma barely touched her food, pushing eggs around her plate as if eating were somehow shameful. And Grace, sweet Grace, ate with the careful reverence of someone who'd learned not to take sustenance for granted. She savored each bite, her young face showing wonder at flavors that were probably luxuries in her recent experience. "The bedroom suited you well enough?" Silas asked, breaking the silence. "Yes, sir," Clara replied formally. "Very well. Thank you. You don't need to call me sir. Silas will do fine." Clara's eyebrows rose slightly. In her world, he realized, there were clear hierarchies and convicts didn't address their owners by their first names. She was trying to navigate unfamiliar territory without making a mistake that might cost them all dearly. "What would you like us to do today?" Beth asked quietly. "What are our duties?" There it was, the question that had been hanging over the table like morning mist. What did he expect from them? What was their role in his household? He'd acted on impulse yesterday, driven by emotions he didn't fully understand, but now he needed to provide structure, purpose, some kind of framework they could trust. "Today, I think you should rest," he said finally. "Get your bearings. Explore the house and grounds if you want. There are books in the library, a piano in the sitting room if any of you play. The garden could use tending if you're inclined toward that sort of work, but it's not required." The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. Grace looked up from her plate with confusion written across her young features. These women had been property for months, possibly longer. The concept of choice, of leisure, of activities undertaken for pleasure rather than survival. It was foreign to their recent experience. "Mr. Boone," Emma spoke up suddenly, her voice so soft he had to lean forward to hear her. "What happens if we disappoint you, if we can't earn our keep, or if we cause trouble, or if—" "Nothing happens," Silas interrupted gently. "You're safe here. That's not conditional on your behavior or your usefulness. It's just fact." Emma's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide, and Beth reached across to squeeze her hand. There was a story there, Silas realized. Something had taught Emma to expect punishment for existing, for being less than perfect. "I know this is strange," he continued, addressing all four of them. "I know you're waiting for the other boot to drop, for me to reveal some hidden agenda or expectation. Truth is, I'm making this up as I go. I saw you yesterday, and something in me recognized something in you. People who deserved better than they were getting. Maybe we can figure out together what that better looks like." Clara set down her fork and studied his face with those penetrating green eyes. "You're serious. You really don't want anything from us." "I want you to heal," Silas said honestly. "I want you to remember what it feels like to be safe, to make choices, to hope for tomorrow. Beyond that, we'll see what develops." After breakfast, he showed them around the main house properly. The library with its hundreds of books, the sitting room with Margaret's piano still covered in dust sheets, the conservatory where she'd grown flowers during the harsh winter months. Each room held memories that had grown precious and painful in equal measure, but sharing them somehow made them lighter. Grace was drawn immediately to the piano, her fingers trailing over the keys with reverent curiosity. "May I?" she asked, and at his nod, she began to play, a simple melody, probably learned in childhood, but executed with such pure joy that it transformed the dusty room into something alive again. Beth discovered the herb garden behind the kitchen and spent an hour examining the plants with the knowledge of someone who understood their properties. Clara gravitated toward the library, running her fingers along book spines with the hunger of a mind too long denied intellectual stimulation. Only Emma remained withdrawn, following the group but never engaging, responding to direct questions with monosyllables and maintaining a careful distance from anything that might be construed as taking liberties. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Silas found them all gathered on the front porch, watching the sun set over the vast expanse of his land. They sat in the rocking chairs Margaret had chosen, finally beginning to relax into the rhythm of a place that welcomed rather than threatened. "It's beautiful," Grace said softly, echoing her words from the day before. "Yes," Silas agreed, but he was looking at them, at the way Beth's protective vigilance had begun to soften, at the small smile playing around Clara's lips, at the way Grace seemed to glow in the gentle evening light. Even Emma sat a little straighter, a little less like she was trying to disappear. For the first time in 12 years, his porch felt like it was being used for its intended purpose, a place where family gathered at day's end to share the quiet satisfaction of another day survived and savored. By the end of their first week at the ranch, patterns had begun to emerge like familiar paths worn into new ground. Each morning, Silas would find Grace at the piano, her fingers growing more confident with the keys as she remembered songs from what he assumed was a happier childhood. The sound had become part of his morning routine, a gentle melody that seemed to wake the house more kindly than his old habit of solitary silence. Beth had claimed the herb garden as her domain, working with Mrs. Chen to expand the existing beds and plan new ones. Her knowledge of medicinal plants impressed even the practical housekeeper, who began consulting her about remedies for the various aches and ailments that plagued the ranch hands. It was clear Beth had training beyond what most frontier women possessed, though she deflected questions about her background with polite vagueness. Clara had essentially moved into the library, emerging only for meals and fresh air. She read voraciously, everything from agricultural journals to poetry, often carrying a book with her as she explored the ranch grounds. Her intelligence was sharp and far-reaching, and Silas found himself looking forward to their dinner conversations, the first real discussions he'd had in years that weren't about cattle or weather or business. Emma remained an enigma. She helped with household tasks when asked, but never volunteered, spoke only when spoken to, and carried herself like someone expecting punishment for breathing too loudly. Whatever had broken her spirit ran deeper than chains and longer than their recent captivity. It was Jake Morrison who brought the first real complication to their tentative peace. "Boss, we need to talk," he said, catching Silas near the corral after breakfast on Thursday morning. His weathered face wore the expression of a man wrestling with uncomfortable truths. "What's on your mind, Jake?" "The men are talking. About the women. About what you're doing here." Jake removed his hat, running fingers through graying hair. "Most of it ain't charitable speculation." Silas felt his jaw tighten. He'd expected this, dreaded it, but hoped they might have more time before the outside world intruded on the fragile sanctuary he was trying to build. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that suggests you didn't pay $10 for domestic help," Jake said bluntly. "The kind that questions why 4 young women are living in the main house instead of the bunkhouse. The kind that's starting to reach town, where it's growing teeth." The implications hit Silas like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on providing safety and healing that he hadn't fully considered how his unconventional arrangement would appear to others. A wealthy widower taking 4 female convicts into his home, treating them like family rather than property. In the eyes of frontier society, there were only a few ways to interpret such behavior, and none of them were innocent. "What are you suggesting I do?" Jake replaced his hat, meeting Silas's eyes directly. "I'm suggesting you think carefully about what this looks like to folks who don't know you the way I do. These women have been through enough without having their reputations destroyed by association with gossip." That afternoon, Silas found Clara in the library, curled in the leather armchair by the window with a volume of Tennyson. Sunlight caught the auburn highlights in her brown hair, and for a moment she looked so peaceful that he almost turned away, rather than disturb her sanctuary. "Clara, could I speak with you for a moment?" She looked up, immediately alert to the serious tone in his voice. "Of course." He settled into the chair across from her, searching for words to explain a situation that felt impossible to navigate gracefully. "I need to tell you about a problem we're facing, about how our arrangement here might appear to others." Clara closed the book carefully, her intelligent green eyes never leaving his face. "You mean the talk in town about why a respectable rancher would take 4 female convicts into his home?" Her directness shouldn't have surprised him by now, but it still caught him off guard. "You know about the gossip?" "I've lived in frontier towns before, Silas. I understand how they work, how quickly reputations can be destroyed by speculation." She leaned forward slightly. "What I don't understand is why you're warning me about it now. Are you having second thoughts about your offer?" "No," he said immediately, then paused to examine his own certainty. "No, I'm not, but I need you all to understand what staying here might cost you, what it might cost all of us." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window where they could see Grace and Beth walking through the garden together. "We've already lost our reputations, Silas. We're convicts, remember? Ex-prisoners with no family, no prospects, nowhere to go. Whatever gossip exists about us here can't be worse than the reality of what we were facing." But it could affect your futures, your chances of... Of what? Marriage to respectable men who would want wives with prison records. Employment with families who would trust former convicts with their children. Clara's laugh held no bitterness, just weary acceptance of hard truths. You're offering us the first real safety we've known in years. Don't insult us by pretending we have better options to consider. That evening, he gathered all 4 sisters in the sitting room after dinner. They arranged themselves with unconscious hierarchy, Clara taking the lead, Beth protective of Grace, Emma hovering at the periphery as if ready to flee. "I need to be honest with you about something," he began, then explained Jake's warning about the growing gossip, the implications for their reputations, the potential consequences of their unconventional living arrangement. "So what are you saying?" Beth asked when he finished. "That we need to leave, move to the bunkhouse, pretend to be servants instead of guests?" "I'm saying you need to understand what staying here means. For all of us. I'm saying you have choices, and you should make them with full knowledge of the costs." Grace, who'd been silent throughout his explanation, suddenly stood up and walked to the piano. She sat down and began to play. Not one of her gentle morning melodies, but something fierce and determined, a hymn that spoke of standing firm against storms. "This is the first home I've remembered having in 3 years," she said without stopping her playing. "The first place I felt safe since everything changed. If people want to talk, let them talk. They don't know us, and they don't know you." "Grace is right," Clara said firmly. "People will always find reasons to judge what they don't understand. But we do understand what you've given us, Silas, and we understand what we'd be giving up if we let fear of gossip drive us away." Beth nodded agreement, her arm sliding protectively around Grace's shoulders as the young woman continued her defiant hymn. "We've survived worse than whispers." Only Emma remained silent, but when Silas looked at her questioningly, she met his eyes for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "I don't care what they say about me," she whispered. "I stopped caring about my reputation the day I—" She broke off, shaking her head. "This is the first place I felt human instead of just property. That's worth whatever gossip comes with it." Later that night, Silas stood on his porch looking out over land he'd fought to build and protect. The house behind him hummed with a life it hadn't known in 12 years. Grace's soft practice sessions, Beth and Clara discussing garden plans, even Emma's. Quiet presence adding weight to rooms that had felt hollow for too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more gossip, probably confrontation from people who thought they understood his motivations better than he did himself. But tonight, for the first time since Margaret and the boys had died, his home felt like more than just a monument to loss. It felt like a place worth defending. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning in early October, when the autumn air carried the first promise of winter and the cottonwoods along the creek had begun their slow turn toward gold. Silas was reviewing supply orders on the front porch when he spotted the dust cloud approaching from town. 3 riders moving with the deliberate pace of men on official business. Sheriff Tom Bradley led the group, his weathered face grim beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him rode Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church, and Judge Harrison, the territorial magistrate who made his circuit through Mercy Ridge once a month. It was the kind of delegation that spelled trouble, the sort of formal visit that preceded ultimatums. Silas stood as they dismounted, extending the courtesy due their positions while steeling himself for whatever accusations or demands they'd come to deliver. Through the window behind him, he could hear Grace's morning piano practice, a gentle melody that seemed almost defiant in the face of approaching storm clouds. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "what brings you out to the ranch so early?" Sheriff Bradley removed his hat, his movements careful and respectful but unmistakably official. "Silas, we need to have a conversation about your current living arrangements. There have been complaints." "What kind of complaints?" Judge Harrison stepped forward, a thin man with the pale complexion of someone who spent his days indoors with law books rather than under the prairie sun. "Complaints about moral impropriety, Mr. Boone, about a situation that's become the subject of considerable concern among the decent citizens of Mercy Ridge." The piano music stopped abruptly, and Silas knew the sisters were listening from inside the house. Whatever happened here would affect them as much as him, and they deserved to hear it directly rather than through second-hand reports. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation on the porch," Silas suggested, settling back into his chair with deliberate calm. "No point in riding all this way just to stand in the yard." The three men exchanged glances, but accepted his invitation, arranging themselves in the remaining chairs with the stiff formality of men conducting unpleasant business. Pastor Williams cleared his throat, his round face flushed with the discomfort of someone forced to address unseemly topics. "Silas, you're a respected member of our community. You've contributed generously to the church, supported local businesses, employed good men at fair wages. That's why this situation is so troubling." "What situation would that be, Pastor?" "4 unmarried women living in your house without proper supervision or chaperonage," Judge Harrison interrupted. "Female convicts at that, with questionable backgrounds and no family connections to vouch for their character. The appearance of impropriety is—" "The appearance," Silas said quietly, "seems to matter more to you than the reality." Sheriff Bradley leaned forward. "And what is the reality, Silas? Because from where we sit, it looks like you've set up a situation that defies every convention of decent society." Before Silas could answer, the front door opened and Clara stepped onto the porch. She'd obviously been listening, and her green eyes held the controlled fire of someone who'd decided to stop hiding in the shadows. Behind her came Beth, Grace, and finally Emma, who looked terrified but determined not to abandon her companions. "Perhaps," Clara said with deadly politeness, "you'd like to ask us about our living arrangements rather than speculating from a distance." The three men shifted uncomfortably at her directness. Women, especially women of questionable reputation, weren't supposed to insert themselves into conversations between respectable men. But Clara's bearing and educated speech made it difficult to dismiss her as easily as they might have preferred. "Mom," Judge Harrison said stiffly, "this matter concerns legal and moral issues that affect us directly," Beth interrupted, moving protectively closer to Grace. "With respect, Judge, you're discussing our lives and our choices. Don't we have a right to speak for ourselves?" Pastor Williams looked pained. "Ladies, please understand our position. The community has standards, expectations about proper behavior between unmarried men and women. When those standards appear to be violated—" "What standards are being violated?" Clara asked bluntly. "We live in separate rooms, eat at the same table, and conduct ourselves with the same propriety we would in any respectable household. Are you suggesting there's something inherently immoral about that arrangement? You're unmarried women with no family supervision living in the home of an unmarried man," Judge Harrison said, his voice rising slightly. "The potential for impropriety is obvious." Grace stepped forward then, her young voice carrying a strength that surprised even Silas. "Judge Harrison, I've been in places where impropriety wasn't just potential, it was guaranteed. I've seen what happens to women when they have no protection, no choices, no one willing to defend them. Mr. Boone offered us safety when no one else would. If that violates your standards of propriety, then perhaps your standards need examining." The silence that followed was profound. Grace had spoken with the authority of someone who'd seen the worst of frontier life and found sanctuary in an unexpected place. Her youth made her words even more powerful, impossible to dismiss as the cynicism of hardened criminals. Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat. "The thing is, Silas, there are legal considerations here too. Those contracts you hold, they make you responsible for these women's behavior and welfare. If there are accusations of impropriety, of moral corruption, the territorial government could revoke those contracts and reassign them elsewhere. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized what they were really saying. This wasn't just about gossip or community standards. This was about power, about men who thought they could dictate the terms of other people's lives based on their own narrow definitions of respectability. And where would they be reassigned? He asked quietly. There are other ranchers who've expressed interest, Judge Harrison said. Men who would provide appropriate supervision and ensure proper moral standards were maintained. Silas caught the quick glance that passed between Clara and Beth, saw the way Grace's face went pale. They all knew what appropriate supervision and proper moral standards would mean in the hands of men like Ben Hartwell or Claude Brennan. They'd be worked from dawn to midnight, housed in barns or sheds, treated as property rather than people. "I see," Silas said, his voice carefully controlled. "And what would satisfy the community's concerns about our current arrangement?" Pastor Williams leaned forward eagerly, clearly relieved to move toward solutions rather than dwelling on problems. "Marriage, of course, would resolve all questions of propriety. If you were to marry one of these women, the others could remain as her companions without any appearance of impropriety." The suggestion hit the porch like a physical blow. Emma made a small sound of distress, while Beth's arm tightened protectively around Grace. Clara's eyes flashed with something between anger and disgust. "You're suggesting," she said slowly, "that Mr. Boone should marry one of us to legitimize his charity toward the others." "It's a practical solution," Judge Harrison said defensively. "Marriage would provide proper moral supervision while maintaining your current living arrangements." "Like buying a chaperone," Beth said with bitter humor. "How romantic." Silas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the porch boards. The casual way these men discussed marriage as a business arrangement, treating it as nothing more than a legal convenience to satisfy social conventions, struck him as profoundly offensive to everything the institution should represent. "Gentlemen," he said firmly, "I appreciate your concern for community standards, but these women are not property to be bartered for social convenience. They're people who found safety here, and I'll not see them used as pawns in games of moral politics." The three men rose as well, their faces reflecting varying degrees of disappointment and frustration. They'd come expecting compliance, assuming their authority would carry the day. "Think carefully about your position, Silas," Sheriff Bradley warned. "Public opinion has power in small communities. It can make life very difficult for those who choose to ignore it." After they'd mounted their horses and ridden away, Silas found himself alone on the porch with four women whose futures had just become significantly more complicated. The easy peace of their first weeks together had been shattered by the harsh reality of social expectations and legal technicalities. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I brought this on all of us by acting without thinking through the consequences." "No," Clara said fiercely. "You brought us home when we had none. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The pressure began subtly, the way winter approaches in the high plains, gradual shifts that accumulate into something impossible to ignore. In the days following the visit from the town's moral authorities, Silas found his usual suppliers suddenly reluctant to make their scheduled deliveries. The blacksmith discovered urgent repairs needed on equipment he'd been maintaining perfectly well for years. Even Dr. Harley, who'd been his friend for over a decade, seemed uncomfortable during their chance meeting outside the bank. "It's gotten ugly, Silas," the doctor had said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Folks are talking about boycotts, about making it clear that Mercy Ridge won't tolerate moral corruption. Judge Harrison's been making speeches about community standards and the need to take decisive action. The economic warfare was effective precisely because it was indirect. No one had to take a public stand against him. They could simply find excuses to avoid doing business with the Lazy Bee Ranch until he came to his senses. It was the sort of coordinated pressure that small communities excelled at applying when someone stepped too far outside accepted boundaries. But it was Emma who bore the worst of it. She'd been making tentative trips to town, usually accompanying Mrs. Chen to the general store for supplies. These small expeditions had seemed to be helping her emerge from the shell of fear and shame she'd carried since arriving at the ranch. Silas had begun to hope that she was finally starting to heal from whatever trauma had left her so broken. Then she'd returned from town one Thursday afternoon with tears streaming down her face and bruises on her arm where someone had grabbed her roughly. "What happened?" Clara demanded, immediately rising from her chair in the library where she'd been reading to Grace. Emma shook her head, unable or unwilling to speak. It was Mrs. Chen who provided the details, her usually calm face flushed with indignation. "Bert Crawford from the hardware store," she reported grimly, "saw Emma looking at some fabric and made comments about fancy whores shopping for pretty dresses. When she tried to leave, he grabbed her arm and suggested she should show proper appreciation for respectable folks' tolerance." Beth's face went white with fury. "He put his hands on her. I stopped it before it went further," Mrs. Chen continued. "But there were others watching, nodding along like they approved. The whole town's gone poison against us." Silas felt something dark and cold settle in his chest. He'd expected gossip, social pressure, even economic retaliation. But physical intimidation of women under his protection crossed a line he wouldn't tolerate. "I'm going to town," he said, reaching for his hat. "No." The voice was Emma's, soft but surprisingly firm. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes that held more steel than he'd ever seen from her. "Please, it'll only make things worse. He can't put his hands on you and walk away from it. He can and he will because that's how the world works for women like us," Emma said with bitter clarity. "But if you go charging into town like some avenging angel, you'll just prove what they're all saying, that you're emotionally compromised, that we've corrupted your judgment." Clara moved to Emma's side, taking her trembling hands. "She's right, Silas. Much as we appreciate the impulse to defend us, confrontation right now will only escalate things." That evening, Silas found himself in his study with the contracts that bound the 4 women to his ranch spread across his desk. The legal language was clear enough. He was responsible for their welfare and behavior for 2 years, after which they would be free to make their own choices about their futures. But the reality was more complex than any contract could capture. They weren't really free now, despite his good intentions. They were trapped between his protection and the outside world's hostility, dependent on his ability to shield them from consequences they had no power to face alone. The very safety he'd tried to provide had become another form of prison, albeit a comfortable one. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Come in." Beth entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the sort of determined expression he'd learned to associate with difficult conversations. "You're thinking of releasing us," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Breaking the contracts, sending us away to protect us from the town's anger." Her directness shouldn't have surprised him anymore, but it still caught him off guard. The thought had occurred to me. "And where exactly would we go?" Beth asked reasonably. "What opportunities await 4 women with prison records and no family connections in a territory where news travels faster than stagecoaches?" Silas had no good answer for that. The frontier was particularly harsh to women without male protection, and their status as ex-convicts would follow them wherever they went. "At least you'd be free to make your own choices," he said finally. "Would we? Or would we just be trading your protection for someone else's control?" Beth sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Silas, I need to tell you something about our situation that might change how you see things." Something in her tone made him look up sharply. There was a weight to her words that suggested secrets about to be revealed. "We weren't just random women caught up in the justice system," Beth continued carefully. "Our stories are connected in ways that make staying together more than just preference. It's necessity. What do you mean? Beth was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. Clara was a teacher at a school for girls in Denver. A good teacher, loved by her students, but she made the mistake of reporting that one of the school's prominent benefactors was inappropriate with some of the younger girls. Silas felt his stomach tighten as the implications became clear. The man had influence, connections to judges and lawmakers. Clara found herself accused of theft, embezzlement, corrupting young minds with inappropriate materials. The charges were fabricated, but they stuck because he had more power than truth. And the rest of you? Emma was one of Clara's students. She tried to support Clara's accusations, testified about what she'd witnessed. For her trouble, she was branded as equally corrupt, equally guilty. Beth's voice grew softer. Grace is Emma's younger sister. She was just guilty of loyalty to family. And I... She paused, staring into her coffee cup as if it contained answers to questions she wasn't ready to ask. I was the school's nurse. I'd treated some of the girls after his visits, documented injuries that couldn't be explained by accidents. When Clara came forward, I supported her with medical evidence. That made me part of the conspiracy in the eyes of the law. The room fell silent, except for the tick of the mantel clock and the distant sound of Grace practicing piano in the sitting room. Silas felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place, the way they protected each other, the education they all clearly possessed, the particular kind of wariness they showed around men in authority. So you see, Beth continued, we can't just scatter to different towns and start over. We're bound together by more than convenience or affection. We're the only witnesses to each other's innocence, the only proof that we're more than what our records claim. Does the town know any of this? Some of it, probably. Enough to make their disapproval even stronger. We're not just ex-convicts, we're women who dared to challenge a man's authority, who refused to stay silent when silence was safer. Beth met his eyes directly. The question is, does knowing the truth change anything for you? Silas stood and walked to the window, looking out over the darkening landscape of his ranch. The truth didn't change his commitment to protecting them, but it added layers of complexity he hadn't anticipated. These women weren't just seeking sanctuary. They were refugees from a war between justice and power, between truth and influence. It changes everything, he said finally. And it changes nothing. You're still safe here, still welcome here, but now I understand why the stakes are so much higher than simple gossip. That night, as he prepared for bed, Silas found himself thinking about the leather-bound journal that sat locked in his desk drawer, Margaret's diary from the last months of her life. She'd written in it every day during her illness, recording her thoughts about death and legacy, about what she hoped their boys would remember of her. One entry had haunted him particularly. I pray that if Silas ever has the chance to do real good in this world, he'll have the courage to see it through regardless of the cost. Standing at his bedroom window, looking out over land that represented everything he'd built and achieved, Silas realized that Margaret's prayer was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. The letter arrived on a gray November morning, when frost had turned the world crystalline and brittle. Jake Morrison brought it up from town with the weekly supply run, his face grim with the knowledge that mail from territorial officials rarely brought good news. The envelope bore the official seal of the Colorado Territorial Government and was addressed to Mr. Silas Boone, custodian of female prisoners, Clara Mitchell, Beth Hartman, Emma Foster, and Grace Foster. Silas opened it in his study with steady hands, though something in his gut warned him that whatever lay inside would shatter the fragile peace they'd built over the past 2 months. The letter was brief and precisely worded, the language of bureaucracy wrapped around a message that hit like a physical blow. Mr. Boone, it began, it has come to the attention of this office that serious irregularities exist in your management of the above-named prisoners. Complaints have been filed regarding moral impropriety, failure to maintain proper supervision, and violation of the terms of custodial agreement. Effective immediately, reassignment procedures will commence. A territorial marshal will arrive within 10 days to transfer custody of the prisoners to more appropriate facilities. The signature belonged to Samuel Morrison, territorial administrator, a man Silas had never met, but whose reputation for rigid interpretation of regulations was well known throughout Colorado Territory. But it was the second paragraph that made his blood run cold. Furthermore, investigation has revealed that the original convictions of these prisoners were obtained through testimony provided by one Clarence Whitmore, whose credibility has since been called into question by certain recent discoveries. However, until formal appeals can be processed through proper channels, the original sentences remain in effect. Silas read the letter 3 times before its full implications settled in his mind. Someone had been pulling strings in Denver, applying pressure through official channels to force the reassignment of his wards. But more importantly, there was apparently evidence that might exonerate the sisters, evidence that had been discovered but not yet acted upon. He was still processing this information when Clara appeared in his doorway, her face pale with the intuitive knowledge that something momentous had occurred. "Bad news?" she asked quietly. "Complicated news," he replied, handing her the letter. As Clara read, her expression shifted from concern to anger to something that looked almost like relief. When she finished, she sank into the chair across from his desk, her hands trembling slightly. "Clarence Whitmore," she said, and the name came out like a curse. "They've finally caught up with him. You know him. He was the man who orchestrated our convictions, the benefactor of our school whose activities I reported. Apparently his credibility has been called into question." Clara's laugh held no humor. "I wonder what finally brought him down. It certainly wasn't justice." Before Silas could respond, Beth appeared in the doorway, followed by Grace and Emma. They'd obviously been waiting together, sensing from Clara's absence that serious matters were being discussed. "Tell us," Beth said simply. Clara handed her the letter, and the 3 women crowded around to read it together. Grace made a small sound of distress when she reached the part about reassignment, while Emma went even paler than usual. But it was Beth who voiced what they were all thinking. 10 days, she said grimly. 10 days before they take us away from here and hand us over to men who will see us as property rather than people." "But there's evidence," Grace said desperately. "Evidence that might prove we're innocent. Doesn't that mean—" "It means that someday, maybe, if the territorial bureaucracy moves faster than usual, and if the evidence is as compelling as they suggest, we might be exonerated," Clara interrupted. "But until then, we're still convicts, still bound by these contracts, still subject to transfer at the government's discretion." Emma had been silent throughout the exchange, but now she stood abruptly, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't go back to that. I won't survive it." The raw desperation in her voice cut through the room like a blade. Over the past months, Emma had slowly begun to emerge from the shell of trauma that had enclosed her since arriving at the ranch. But the prospect of being handed over to men like Bert Crawford, or worse, was clearly more than her fragile recovery could bear. "You won't have to," Silas said firmly, though he had no idea how he could make good on that promise. "We'll find a way to fight this." "How?" Beth demanded. "The letter's clear. This is a done deal. Someone with more influence than we have has decided our fate." Silas stood and began pacing, his mind racing through possibilities and finding precious few that offered real hope. They could flee, of course, but 4 women and a man traveling together would attract attention, and harboring escaped prisoners would make him a fugitive as well. They could try legal channels, but territory courts moved slowly and were susceptible to the same influences that had convicted them in the first place. Then a thought struck him, so obvious and so dangerous that he almost dismissed it immediately. "There might be a way," he said slowly. But it would require a sacrifice from all of us, and it might not work. What kind of sacrifice? Clara asked warily. Silas stopped pacing and faced them directly. Marriage. If one of you were to marry me before the marshal arrives, the others could claim kinship protection. A man's wife and her female relatives can't be seized as convict laborers without his consent. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. This wasn't the casual suggestion the town officials had made weeks earlier. This was a desperate gambit with real consequences for everyone involved. That's, Grace began, then stopped, clearly struggling with the implications. Insane, Beth finished. Silas, you can't sacrifice your life to save ours. Marriage should be about love, about choice, about survival sometimes, Clara interrupted quietly. About protection and practical necessity. It wouldn't be the first frontier marriage built on mutual benefit rather than romance. Emma looked up sharply. You're considering it? I'm considering all our options, Clara replied, because the alternatives are worse than uncomfortable marriages. Much worse. Silas found himself studying each of their faces, trying to read their thoughts. Grace looked torn between hope and horror at the idea. Beth seemed calculating, weighing costs and benefits with the practical mind of someone who'd learned to prioritize survival over sentiment. Emma appeared terrified, but desperate, clinging to any possibility that might spare her from reassignment. And Clara was looking at him with those penetrating green eyes that seemed to see straight through to his motivations. You'd really do it, she said, not quite a question. I'd really do it, for any of you, all of you, if there were a way to make that legal. But which of us? Grace asked softly. How could we choose? How could you? Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the study window, Silas could see 3 riders approaching fast from town. Jake Morrison and 2 men he didn't recognize. Their pace suggested urgency, possibly emergency. Stay here, he told the sisters, then went to meet the riders on the front porch. Jake dismounted quickly, his face flushed with excitement and worry. Boss, these men rode hard from Denver. Say they have news about the women's cases. The 2 strangers were clearly officials, their clothing too clean, their bearing too formal for ordinary frontier travelers. The older of the 2 stepped forward, removing his hat with crisp efficiency. Mr. Boone, I'm Marshal James Patterson, and this is Attorney General's investigator, David Wells. We need to speak with you and the women immediately about developments in their cases. What kind of developments? Wells stepped forward, his young face animated with the excitement of someone bearing important news. Clarence Whitmore is dead, Mr. Boone. Killed 3 days ago in a Denver hotel room. But before he died, he confessed to a number of crimes, including the fabrication of evidence used to convict 4 women from a girls' school. Clara Mitchell, Beth Hartman, Emma Foster, and Grace Foster. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Silas gripped the porch railing for support as the implications crashed over him. You're saying they're innocent? We're saying their convictions are being overturned effective immediately, Marshal Patterson replied. They're free women, Mr. Boone. Free to go where they choose, do what they choose, be what they choose. From inside the house came the sound of Grace's piano, the opening notes of a hymn that sounded like a celebration. But as Silas listened, he realized it might also sound like a goodbye. Freedom arrived with less fanfare than Silas had expected. Marshal Patterson and Investigator Wells spent an hour in the sitting room, methodically explaining the legal implications of Clarence Whitmore's deathbed confession, while the 4 sisters listened with expressions that cycled between disbelief, relief, and something that looked almost like loss. Your criminal records will be expunged within the week, Wells explained, consulting his leather portfolio with the efficiency of a man accustomed to delivering life-changing news. You'll receive official documentation clearing your names, along with compensation for wrongful imprisonment. Though I should warn you, the territorial government isn't generous with such payments." "How much?" Beth asked practically. $50 each, Patterson replied. "Not much for what you've endured, but it's something to start over with." $200 total. Silas had spent more than that on a single bull the previous spring. For women who'd lost everything, their reputations, their careers, their freedom, it seemed an insulting gesture. But Clara nodded as if she'd expected as much. "What about Whitmore?" she asked. "What finally brought him down?" Wells's young face darkened. He made the mistake of expanding his activities to include the daughter of a Denver banker, money and influence that exceeded his own. The girl's father hired private investigators who uncovered a pattern going back years. Girls from poor families, institutions like your school, anyone without powerful protectors. "Girls like us," Emma said quietly. "Girls exactly like you." His confession implicated several accomplices, including the judge who presided over your trial and the prosecutor who built the case against you. There'll be a significant scandal when the full story becomes public. After the officials left, the house settled into a strange quietude that felt heavier than their former uncertainty. Freedom, Silas realized, brought its own complications. For months, their choices had been limited by legal constraints and social pressures. Now suddenly, they faced unlimited options, and that vastness seemed almost overwhelming. They gathered in the dining room for what felt like a council of war, though no one had explicitly called it that. Grace sat at the piano, her fingers picking out melancholy fragments of songs she'd learned in childhood. Clara occupied her usual chair by the window, a book unopened in her lap. Beth moved restlessly around the room, tidying things that didn't need tidying. Emma stood by the fireplace, staring into flames that offered no answers to unasked questions. "So," Clara said finally, "we can go anywhere, do anything, be anyone we choose. The question is, what do we choose?" "I don't know," Grace admitted, her voice small in the large room. "I've been thinking about freedom for so long, but now that I have it, I'm not sure what to do with it." "We could go back to Denver," Beth suggested without much enthusiasm. "Try to rebuild our lives there, maybe find positions with families who need nurses and teachers and deal with the whispers about our past every day for the rest of our lives," Emma interrupted, speaking up with more force than usual. "Even with our names cleared, people will remember. There'll always be someone who believes there's no smoke without fire." Clara nodded grimly. "Emma's right. Legal exoneration doesn't erase public memory. We might be innocent in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of society, we'll always be women who were once imprisoned, once accused, once fallen." Silas had been listening from the doorway, reluctant to intrude on their deliberations, but unable to stay away. This was the conversation he'd been dreading since the marshal's announcement, the moment when they would decide whether the family they'd built together was strong enough to survive the freedom to leave. "There's another option," he said quietly, stepping into the room. 4 pairs of eyes turned to him with expressions ranging from hope to wariness. "You could stay," he continued, "all of you. Not as convicts or wards or anything other than what you've become. Family. This house has room for all of you, for as long as you want it." "As what?" Clara asked with characteristic directness. "Your guests? Your charity cases? Your permanent dependents?" The question hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications they'd all been thinking about but no one had voiced. What was their relationship now that legal obligations no longer defined it? What were they to each other when choice replaced compulsion? "As partners," Silas said, the word emerging before he'd fully formed the thought. "In everything. The ranch, the decisions, the future we build here." Beth stopped her restless movement, turning to face him fully. "What are you saying exactly?" Silas realized he was venturing into territory he hadn't fully mapped, making offers whose implications he hadn't completely considered. But something about this moment, the four women who'd brought his house back to life, the possibility of their departure, the weight of choices that would define all their futures, demanded honesty rather than caution. I'm saying this ranch is too big for one person to manage alone. I'm saying you've all proven yourselves invaluable. Clara with her education and business sense, Beth with her medical knowledge and practical skills, Grace with her music and her ability to bring joy to any room she enters, Emma with her quiet strength and surprising wisdom. He paused, looking at each of them in turn. I'm saying that what we've built here is worth preserving, worth protecting, worth making permanent if you're willing. And the gossip? Grace asked softly. The town's disapproval. All of that will continue, maybe get worse now that we're not under legal constraint. Let them talk, Silas said with surprising vehemence. Let them boycott my business and whisper behind their hands and write letters to territorial officials. I've got enough money to weather their disapproval and enough land to keep us independent of their approval. Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out over the vast expanse of prairie that stretched toward the horizon. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman deep in thought, weighing options with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned that choices carried consequences. It would be unconventional, she said finally. Scandalous, Beth added. Beautiful, Grace whispered. They all turned to look at Emma, who'd remained silent throughout the exchange. She stood with her back to the fire, shadows and light playing across features that had grown stronger and more confident over their months at the ranch. I'm tired of being afraid, she said quietly. Afraid of what people will say, afraid of what they'll think, afraid of not being good enough or respectable enough or proper enough. For the first time in my life, I'm in a place where I feel valued for who I am, rather than judged for what I'm not. She looked around the room, meeting each of their eyes in turn. If we leave here, if we scatter to different towns and try to build separate lives, we'll always be carrying pieces of this family with us. We'll always be wondering what might have been if we'd had the courage to stay together. It won't be easy, Clara warned. The town will make life difficult. There'll be constant pressure to conform, to justify ourselves, to prove we're worth accepting. When has life ever been easy for women like us? Beth asked with a slight smile. At least here we'd be facing difficulties together with someone who actually cares about our welfare. Silas felt something tight and worried in his chest begin to loosen. You're considering staying? We're considering more than that, Clara said, turning back from the window with an expression that was half smile, half challenge. We're considering your offer of partnership. All of it. What would that look like, practically speaking? Grace asked. How would we structure something so unprecedented? Clara finished. I'm not entirely sure. But I think it would start with complete honesty about what we all want and need from this arrangement. And what do you want? Silas asked. Clara was quiet for a long moment, then smiled with genuine warmth. I want to wake up every morning knowing I'm home. I want to use my education for something meaningful instead of hiding it like a shameful secret. I want to be part of building something that matters, something that lasts. I want to practice medicine, Beth said firmly. Really practice it, not just tend herbs in a garden. There are people in this territory who need proper medical care, and I have the knowledge to provide it if I can find a way to get past the prejudice against women in the profession. I want to teach, Grace said softly. Children, adults, anyone who wants to learn music or letters or numbers. There are families out here with no access to education, and I could change that. Emma took a deep breath before speaking. I want to learn to trust myself again. I want to discover who I am when I'm not afraid all the time, and I want to do it surrounded by people who see my worth instead of my weakness. The room fell silent except for the tick of the mantel clock and the distant lowing of cattle in the evening pastures. They were all looking at Silas now, waiting for his response to their honesty, their trust, their willingness to build something unprecedented together. Then we'll build it, he said simply. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, whatever the cost, we'll build something here that's worth all the gossip and disapproval and official scrutiny in the world. Outside, the November wind was picking up, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter was approaching. But inside, warmed by firelight and possibility, they began to plan a future that would require all their courage, all their determination, and all their faith in each other to achieve. The conversation continued deep into the night, touching on practical matters like legal arrangements and business structures, but also on dreams and hopes that none of them had dared voice before. By the time they finally went to their separate rooms, they were no longer 4 women seeking sanctuary and 1 man offering charity. They were 5 people choosing to become a family by design rather than circumstance, partners in an enterprise that would challenge every convention their society held dear. The confrontation came at dawn, when the winter sky was still painted in shades of gray, and the frost made every blade of grass glitter like broken crystal. Silas was checking on the horses when he spotted them, a delegation riding hard from town, their breath and their mounts creating clouds in the cold morning air. But this wasn't the polite official visit of weeks past. This was a mob dressed in the clothes of respectability, led by Judge Harrison but including faces that made Silas's blood run cold. Ben Hartwell rode beside the judge, his cruel smile visible even at a distance. Claude Brennan flanked them on the left, along with Tom Morrison and half a dozen other men whose reputations for violence were barely concealed beneath their business suits. They came to a stop in the ranch yard, like an army claiming territory, their horses snorting and stamping while the men dismounted with the deliberate movements of people prepared for confrontation. Silas counted 12 of them total, far more than any legitimate business would require. Boone, Judge Harrison's voice, carried the authority of law and the weight of threatened violence. "We need to talk." Silas stepped out of the stable, his hands empty but positioned where he could reach the rifle, leaning against the doorframe if necessary. "About what?" "About this obscene situation you've created," Harrison replied, his thin face flushed with righteous indignation. "These women may be legally free, but that doesn't give you license to continue this immoral arrangement." From the house came the sound of the front door opening, and Silas knew without looking that Clara, Beth, Grace, and Emma were stepping onto the porch. They'd obviously heard the commotion and come to face whatever was about to happen. Their presence both strengthened his resolve and multiplied his fears. If this turned violent, they would be in immediate danger. "What arrangement would that be?" Silas asked evenly, though his muscles were tense and ready. Ben Hartwell spat into the dirt, his eyes fixed on the women with an expression that made Silas want to reach for his rifle immediately. "4 whores living in your house like wives. It's an insult to every decent family in the territory." "Watch your tongue," Silas said quietly, but the warning carried enough menace to make several of the men shift uncomfortably. "The truth hurts, does it?" Claude Brennan spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "We've been patient with your eccentricities, Boone, but patience has limits." Judge Harrison stepped forward, apparently trying to maintain some pretense of legal authority. "The territorial government may have cleared their criminal records, but that doesn't absolve you of responsibility to community standards. These women need proper supervision, appropriate housing, legitimate employment. They have all of that." Clara's voice carried clearly across the yard as she stepped down from the porch, her green eyes blazing with controlled fury. "We have employment managing Mr. Boone's household and business affairs. We have appropriate housing in comfortable rooms, and we supervise ourselves, being adult women of sound mind and strong character." "Adult women with criminal pasts," Brennan sneered. "Former prisoners who corrupted young girls and former prisoners who are wrongfully convicted by a system designed to protect men like you," Beth interrupted, joining Clara in the yard. "Former prisoners whose only crimes were telling the truth about powerful men who preyed on vulnerable girls." The morning air crackled with tension as Grace and Emma also moved to stand beside their friends. Emma's face was pale but determined, while Grace held herself with the dignity of someone who'd found her courage and refused to surrender it. "This ends today," Harrison declared, his legal authority cracking to reveal the mob mentality beneath. "You'll either make proper arrangements for these women, marriage, employment in town, departure from the territory, or we'll take steps to ensure community standards are maintained." "What kind of steps?" Silas asked, though he suspected he already knew. Tom Morrison, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke up. "The kind that make it clear Mercy Ridge won't tolerate moral corruption. The kind that ensure certain businesses can't operate in our territory." The threat was clear enough. They couldn't force him to abandon the women legally, but they could make life impossible through economic warfare, social isolation, and, if necessary, direct action. The number of men they'd brought suggested they were prepared for more than conversation. "I see," Silas said calmly. "And what exactly do you propose?" "Marriage," Harrison said bluntly. "Choose one of them as a wife, send the others away to appropriate employment, and we can all pretend this embarrassment never happened." "And if I refuse?" The silence that followed was heavy with implied violence. These men had come prepared to enforce their will through whatever means necessary, and they clearly believed their numerical advantage made the outcome inevitable. But they had miscalculated in one crucial respect. They had assumed this was a negotiation between equals, a discussion among civilized men about how to handle an inconvenient situation. They hadn't realized they were threatening the only family Silas had found in 12 years. The only happiness he'd known since Margaret and the boys died. "Then we'll make sure you understand the consequences of defying community standards," Brennan said softly, his hand moving casually toward the gun at his hip. That small gesture, the implicit threat of violence against women who'd already endured too much, shattered the last of Silas's patience. "Gentlemen," Silas said, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man who'd made his final decision, "I'm going to give you one chance to mount your horses and ride back to town. Take it." The words hung in the cold morning air like a challenge thrown down between armies. Ben Hartwell laughed, a sound devoid of humor or humanity. "You're outnumbered 12-1, Boone. Your ranch hands are too far away to help, and those women can't protect you from—" The crack of a rifle shot cut him off mid-sentence, echoing across the ranch yard and sending several of the horses skittering nervously. All eyes turned toward the house, where Mrs. Chen stood on the porch with a smoking rifle in her hands and an expression of grim determination on her weathered face. 13-1, actually," she called out, "and I've got 5 more rifles inside, all loaded and ready." As if summoned by her words, Jake Morrison and 3 ranch hands appeared around the corner of the barn, their own weapons clearly visible. Their faces held the hard resolve of men who'd chosen their side and were prepared to defend it. "Make that 17-12, Jake said conversationally, though his rifle remained pointed at the ground in a gesture more threatening than any direct aim. "And we know this ground a lot better than you do." The mathematical advantage had shifted, but more than that, the moral certainty of the town delegation began to waver as they realized they'd walked into a situation where their intended victims were prepared to fight back. Clara stepped forward, her voice carrying across the yard with the authority of an educated woman who'd faced down powerful men before. "Judge Harrison, you and your friends came here threatening violence against women whose only crime was accepting an offer of safety and partnership. Is that really the moral standard you want to represent?" "You're living in sin," Pastor Williams called out, his round face flushed with embarrassment and indignation. "Outside the bounds of decent society, flouting every convention of proper behavior." "Proper according to whom?" Grace asked, her young voice surprisingly strong. She moved to stand beside Clara, her chin raised in defiance. "Proper according to men who think women are property to be bought and sold. Proper according to a society that protects predators and punishes their victims? Emma spoke up for the first time, her voice soft but carrying in the crystal air. I've lived in your version of proper society, Pastor. I've seen what it does to girls who have no one to protect them. I'll take honest partnership with good people over false respectability any day. Beth joined them, completing the line of women standing united against the mounted men. We've found family here. We've found purpose and safety and the freedom to be ourselves without fear. If that threatens your idea of proper society, perhaps your society needs examining, not us. Judge Harrison's face cycled through several expressions: anger, frustration, and finally a kind of desperate calculation. This isn't over, Boone. The territorial government won't tolerate this kind of moral corruption indefinitely. There are laws. There are indeed, Clara interrupted smoothly. Laws against threatening citizens on their own property. Laws against conspiracy to commit violence. Laws that protect the rights of free women to choose their own living arrangements. Her smile was sharp as winter steel. Would you like me to recite the specific statutes, Judge? My legal education may have been interrupted by wrongful imprisonment, but it wasn't erased. The silence that followed was profound. These men had come expecting to face an isolated rancher and 4 helpless women. Instead, they'd encountered organized resistance, legal knowledge, and the uncomfortable realization that they were the ones breaking the law. Claude Brennan, perhaps sensing the tide turning against them, made one last attempt at intimidation. You can't watch them all the time, Boone. Accidents happen to folks who don't know their place. That threat, veiled but unmistakable, proved to be his mistake. Silas moved with the fluid efficiency of a man who'd spent years making life-or-death decisions in frontier conditions. His rifle appeared in his hands as if by magic, the barrel centered on Brennan's chest with unwavering precision. Claude, Silas said conversationally, I want you to think very carefully about your next words, because if I interpret them as a direct threat against these women, I'm going to exercise my legal right to defend my property and family from criminal assault. The rancher's eyes went wide as he realized how completely the situation had shifted. The other men began backing their horses away, suddenly understanding that their show of force had turned into a potential massacre with themselves as the likely victims. This isn't finished, Judge Harrison said weakly, his authority crumbling like sand in a windstorm. Yes, it is, Silas replied firmly. It's finished because I'm going to make something very clear to all of you. These women are under my protection as permanent members of my household. Any threat against them is a threat against me. Any action taken against them will be answered in full. He swept the rifle barrel across the group of mounted men, letting each of them see their death reflected in its dark circle. I've spent 23 years building this ranch, earning respect through hard work and fair dealing. But if you force me to choose between your approval and their safety, I'll burn every bridge in the territory without hesitation. The sound of retreating hoofbeats was the sweetest music Silas had heard in years. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning when the prairie grass had turned emerald and the cottonwoods along the creek wore crowns of new leaves, Silas stood on his front porch watching a sight that would have seemed impossible a year ago. In the front yard, Beth was conducting what she'd started calling her outdoor surgery, treating a ranch hand's broken arm while Grace assisted, taking notes on everything Beth did. The young woman had proven to have both steady hands and a quick mind for medical work, and Beth had begun training her as an apprentice nurse. Near the garden, Clara was meeting with 3 families from neighboring ranches, helping them establish a one-room school for their children. Her reputation as an educator had slowly overcome the scandal of her past, aided by parents desperate enough for their children's education to overlook social conventions. The sound of her measured, patient voice explaining arithmetic concepts drifted across the yard. Emma had surprised everyone by revealing a talent for managing the ranch's business affairs. She worked from a desk in the front room, keeping books that were more organized than anything Silas had ever accomplished alone. corresponding with cattle buyers from 3 territories and slowly building relationships with suppliers who'd initially boycotted the ranch. Her quiet competence had proven more persuasive than any argument. The house itself had been transformed from the empty monument to grief it had been for 12 years into something vibrantly, chaotically alive. Meals were communal affairs filled with conversation and laughter. The library hosted evening discussions about everything from agricultural innovations to poetry. Grace's music filled rooms that had been silent too long, while the sound of women's voices planning and arguing and sharing stories had erased the echoes of solitude that had haunted Silas for so many years. The transformation hadn't been without cost. Judge Harrison had made good on his threat to involve territorial authorities, resulting in 3 official investigations into their living arrangements. Each investigation had concluded that no laws were being broken, no moral corruption was taking place, and the arrangement was within the rights of free citizens to establish. Several businesses in town continued their boycott, though others had quietly resumed trading with the ranch when they realized that principle didn't pay bills. The social isolation was real and sometimes painful, but it was balanced by the slow growth of understanding among neighbors who'd gotten to know them as individuals rather than symbols. Dr. Harley had become a frequent visitor, officially consulting with Beth on difficult cases, but unofficially serving as their bridge to the more reasonable elements of Mercy Ridge society. Pastor Williams had never quite overcome his disapproval, but he'd stopped preaching sermons about moral corruption and had even acknowledged Grace's contributions to the church's music program. Most importantly, they'd all discovered what it meant to choose family rather than simply accept the one circumstance provided. The bonds between them had been tested by external pressure, internal disagreements, and the simple challenge of 5 very different people learning to share space and decisions and dreams. Emma had blossomed from the frightened, broken woman she'd been into someone with quiet confidence and surprising strength. Her trauma would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her entire existence. Grace had grown from a scared girl into a young woman with purpose and direction. Her music had become a bridge between their unconventional household and the wider community. Her performances at church socials and community gatherings slowly changing hearts and minds that argument couldn't reach. Beth had found a way to practice medicine despite the prejudice against women in the profession, building a reputation based on results rather than credentials. She traveled throughout the territory now, called upon for difficult cases by doctors who were wise enough to value skill over convention. Clara had returned to teaching, though in a very different context than her previous position. Her outdoor schools served 15 children from 7 families, and she was already planning to expand the program as word spread about the quality of education she provided. And Silas had rediscovered what it meant to have a purpose beyond mere survival or accumulation of wealth. The ranch flourished under their combined management, but more than that, it had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose to build something together rather than tear each other down. There had been no formal marriage, no legal ceremonies to satisfy conventional expectations. Instead, they'd created something deeper, a commitment based on mutual respect, shared values, and the daily choice to remain together despite easier alternatives. The 3 silver dollars that had started it all sat in a place of honor on the mantel, polished to a bright shine and mounted in a simple frame Clara had crafted from prairie grass and wildflowers. They'd become a symbol of the price of freedom and the value of choices made from the heart rather than the head. On this particular morning, as Silas watched his chosen family going about their various activities under the wide Montana sky, he felt the same sense of completion he'd once found watching Margaret read to their boys by lamplight. It was a different kind of family, built from necessity and sustained by love, but it was family nonetheless. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention to the road, where a single rider was approaching at an easy pace. As the figure drew closer, Silas recognized Sheriff Bradley, though the man's posture suggested social rather than official business. "Morning, Silas," Bradley called out as he dismounted. "Heard you folks were looking for someone to teach music to the children at Clara's school." "We are," Silas confirmed, curious about where this conversation was heading. "Well, my daughter Mary plays piano pretty well, and she's been looking for something meaningful to do with her time." Bradley's weathered face showed the kind of careful neutrality that suggested internal struggle. "If you think she might be suitable, I'd appreciate you considering her for the position." It was a small thing, really, a simple job inquiry dressed up as casual conversation. But it represented something larger, the beginning of acceptance, the slow recognition that what they'd built here was not only permanent, but valuable to the wider community. "We'd be happy to meet with her," Silas replied. "Have her come by whenever convenient." As Sheriff Bradley rode away, Silas remained on the porch, listening to the sounds of his family, his chosen, fought-for, daily renewed family, filling his home with purpose and joy. Sometimes, he reflected, a man's greatest fortune wasn't what he could accumulate, but who he could convince to stay.